A young black man helped a millionaire change a flat tire, expecting nothing in return. The next day, a sleek black SUV showed up in front of his house, and what happened next left the entire neighborhood in awe. David sat behind the wheel of his SUV, tapping his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. The empty road stretched out ahead, flanked by tall grass swaying in the summer heat. He checked his watch, muttering to himself. He had a big meeting in less than an hour, one he couldn't afford to miss. But as he sped along the narrow, rural road, there was a sudden jolt, followed by a familiar, dreaded thump thump thump. A flat tire. Of course. Just perfect, he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. He sighed and pulled over, kicking up a cloud of dust as his luxury vehicle came to a stop. The moment he stepped out, the heat hit him full force. He winced, adjusted his suit jacket, and loosened his tie. Kneeling beside the tire, he inspected it. It was shredded, with strips of rubber peeling away. He looked up and down the deserted road, then at his phone. No signal. Cursing under his breath, he slipped the phone back into his pocket. This was one problem he'd never had to solve alone before. In his world, people like assistants, chauffeurs, or service crews took care of issues like this. But out here, on this lonely stretch of road with no cell signal, it was just him, his broken-down SUV, and the sweltering heat. David's mind drifted, almost reluctantly, to a memory from years ago. When he was young, he'd been stranded once, needing help, just like now. He remembered the faces of the people who ignored him, who looked the other way. It left a bitter taste, maybe one reason he hated depending on others. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. The sun was beating down harder, the road shimmered in the distance, and tension built in his chest. The sky was clear, and civilization felt like it was miles away. He needed to figure this out before the sun dipped too low. Just then, David squinted into the distance, noticing something, or someone. Just then, David noticed someone moving toward him, a figure in the distance growing clearer. He squinted, trying to make out who it was. It looked like a kid, no older than 14, dressed in a faded t-shirt and worn-out sneakers. As the boy came closer, David saw the look of focus on his face. "Hey, mister. Got trouble with your car?" the boy called out, stopping just a few steps from the SUV, his eyes bright and curious. David hesitated, feeling a mix of relief and cautiousness. "Yeah, flat tire," he replied, keeping his tone steady. "And I'm not exactly sure how to fix it." The boy nodded, stepping closer and giving the shredded tire a quick look before glancing back up at David. "I can help. My dad taught me how to change one," he said, kneeling down to inspect the damaged tire. "Do you have a spare?" David raised an eyebrow. "Wait, you really know how to change a tire?" He looked at the boy, who seemed confident, but David wasn't used to relying on strangers, especially not a kid. The boy looked up with a slight smile. "Yeah, it's just a tire, mister. Not a big deal," he replied, standing up and brushing the dirt off his knees. "The spare's usually in the back, right? Mind if I take a look?" David gave a short nod, a bit unsure but with no better option. He stepped aside, watching as the boy moved with confidence to the back of the SUV and opened the hatch. The kid found the tools and the spare without a second thought. David stood there, unsure of what to do with his hands, glancing down at the boy, who had already started loosening the lug nuts. The wrench moved back and forth with a steady clank. "You're really doing this," David muttered to himself, feeling sweat bead on his back, partly from the heat and partly from the unfamiliar situation. The boy worked swiftly, ignoring the dirt and the weight of the tire. After a while, he looked up, wiping a bit of sweat from his forehead. "You all right, mister? You're looking kind of pale." David cleared his throat and straightened his suit jacket. "I'm fine. Just not used to this sort of thing." The boy gave him a friendly smile, one that struck David with its genuineness. "No problem. You just gotta know where to look and be willing to get your hands a little dirty." David stayed quiet, watching as the kid finished attaching the spare tire. He tightened the bolts quickly, stood up, and wiped his hands on his jeans before stepping back with a thumbs up. "All done." David blinked, almost in disbelief. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and took out a few bills, offering them to the boy. "Here, for your trouble. I appreciate it." The boy immediately shook his head, stepping back. Nah, I don't need that. Just wanted to help. You look like you could use it. David frowned, holding out the money, his hand hanging there awkwardly. No, really. I insist. But the boy just smiled, shook his head again, and started to walk away, waving over his shoulder. Take care, mister. Good luck with wherever you're going. David stood there, stunned, as he watched the boy disappear down the road the same way he had come, the bills still in his hand. He stood for a moment, then let out a long breath. The unease he'd felt hadn't vanished. If anything, it had grown. He wasn't used to this. A simple favor with no expectation of reward. Slipping the money back into his wallet, he got into the driver's seat and started the car. As he drove off, he found himself glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the boy's form grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. David continued driving, but his mind was far from clear. Something about that encounter stuck with him, a feeling he couldn't shake, like he'd been unsettled in a way he didn't fully understand. He pressed his lips together, trying to push the thoughts away, but they lingered long after he'd left that empty road behind. The boy's smile, his refusal of the money, the casual take care he tossed over his shoulder, it all replayed in David's mind over and over. He wasn't used to feeling out of control, to being in a situation where his money and status didn't matter. He eventually pulled into his driveway, the automatic gates opening as his luxury SUV rolled through. His house loomed ahead, sleek and modern, the kind of place where everything looked perfect but felt cold. David parked, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring out the windshield in thought. Hey hon, you're late? Startled, David looked up to see his wife, Clara, standing at the door. She was smiling, but her expression shifted slightly as she saw his face. She stepped closer, concern creasing her brow. Everything all right? Yeah, David replied quickly, forcing a smile. He grabbed his briefcase and climbed out, shutting the door harder than he'd meant to. Had some trouble on the road, just a flat? Clara folded her arms, tilting her head. A flat tire? Did you manage to fix it? He hesitated. Oh, a kid showed up. Fixed it for me. He shrugged, trying to sound casual. Didn't want anything for it. Clara raised an eyebrow. David nodded, his expression growing more serious. Yeah, he didn't want anything. Refused the money I offered him. Just helped and left. Clara studied him for a moment. That's pretty amazing, actually. People aren't usually that nice for nothing these days. David grunted in response, stepping past her into the house. Yeah, well, he wasn't sure why, but her words bothered him. Maybe because she was right. Maybe because he knew he wouldn't have done the same. The evening went on, but that strange feeling wouldn't leave him. At dinner, he barely touched his food. His two kids, Ellie and Josh, chatted about their day, but their voices felt distant, like background noise. Clara noticed, casting him a sideways glance. All right, what's going on? She asked, leaning her elbows on the table. You've been acting weird since you got home. David looked up, blinking as he tried to gather his thoughts. It's nothing. I don't know. He paused, feeling the words almost catch in his throat. It's that kid. I can't stop thinking about it. Ellie looked up from her phone, curious. What kid? David sighed, setting his fork down and leaning back in his chair. The kid who helped me with the flat tire. He wouldn't take any money, just did it like it was the most normal thing in the world, then walked away. He rubbed his forehead, feeling a strange frustration he couldn't explain. I don't get it. Josh smirked. Maybe he's just a good person, Dad. David shot him a look but didn't respond. Clara watched him carefully, her expression softening. Sometimes people do good things just because they can. David. Not everyone expects something in return. David frowned, shaking his head. Yeah, well, it doesn't make sense to me. Everyone wants something. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a scrape. Anyway, I'm going to get some air. Clara nodded, her eyes following him as he walked out to the backyard. He stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, staring out over the manicured lawn. He wanted to dismiss it, to forget about the kid and move on, but there was something there he couldn't shake, the look in the boy's eyes, the way he'd smiled and walked away, as if helping was enough. Later, David went to bed late that night, David lay awake, his thoughts tangled. Clara was already asleep by the time he finally climbed into bed beside her. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the unsettling sense of incompleteness. It was just a flat tire, something that shouldn't have meant anything. But somehow it did. The next morning, David woke with a sense of purpose he couldn't entirely explain. He had to find the boy. He wasn't sure what he'd say or even if he'd find him, but he had to try. He got dressed quickly, opting for casual clothes instead of his usual suit. As he walked toward the door, Clara looked up from her coffee, raising her eyebrows in surprise. "Going somewhere?" David nodded, already reaching for the handle. "I'm going back to where I got the flat." Clara blinked. "To find the kid?" "Yeah," he said, pausing to give her a quick smile. "Don't wait up for me." David climbed back into his SUV, his mind focused as he drove. He remembered the stretch of road, the frustration he'd felt with the flat tire, the helplessness. It didn't take long to reach the spot, but somehow, the landscape felt different today. Less intimidating, more familiar. David slowed the car, parked on the shoulder, and stepped out. The sun was already warming the air, and sweat gathered on his neck as he scanned the distance. Then he saw it, a small, worn house set back from the road. David walked toward it, feeling a mix of hope and anxiety. Asterisk, what if he was wrong? What if this wasn't the boy's house? Asterisk, he shook off the doubt and kept walking. The front yard was unkempt, a few rusty toys scattered around. David stopped at the edge of the walkway, took a deep breath, and knocked firmly on the door. After a moment, there was a soft rustling from inside, and then the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her eyes widening in surprise as she took in David's appearance. His expensive shoes, his watch, and the determined look on his face. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. David cleared his throat. I'm looking for a kid, 14, I think. He helped me with my car yesterday." The woman's expression softened, and she nodded slightly. "You mean Lucas?" David nodded, feeling a weight lift. "Yes, Lucas. I wanted to thank him." The woman stepped back, glancing over her shoulder. "Lucas, come here. Someone's here for you." David heard footsteps, and then Lucas appeared, his eyes widening in recognition. "Oh, hey, mister," he said, a smile spreading across his face. David took a step forward. "Lucas, I wanted to find you. I couldn't stop thinking about what you did for me yesterday. But I need to do something for you in return." Lucas shook his head, his smile unwavering. "I told you, mister, it was no big deal. I just wanted to help." David looked at him, trying to understand the sincerity, the kindness. It was so foreign to him, but he knew he couldn't leave it like this. "Please," David said. "There has to be something I can do for you, for your family." Lucas glanced at his mother, who gave a small nod. He looked back at David, his expression thoughtful. "Well," he said slowly, "maybe there is one thing." David felt a flicker of hope. "Anything," he said quickly. "Whatever you need." Lucas's smile grew wider. "How about you come in for breakfast? We don't have much, but it'd be nice." David blinked, taken aback. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then nodded. "All right, I'd like that." The door swung open wider, and David stepped inside, feeling something shift within him. He didn't know what it was, but maybe, just maybe, this was a start. David sat at the modest wooden table in Lucas's kitchen. The place was small, tidy, but worn. The scent of coffee and eggs filled the air. Lucas's mother moved around the kitchen, preparing breakfast. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not used to being in a setting like this. Everything about it felt alien. Lucas sat across from David, a grin still plastered on his face. "So, what brings you back, really?" Lucas asked, his curiosity evident. David scratched his chin, choosing his words carefully. "Well, I couldn't get yesterday out of my mind," he said, glancing around the kitchen at the simple curtains and the cracked linoleum floor. "You helped me, and I wanted to repay you somehow. It just didn't sit right with me, leaving it like that." Lucas shrugged, taking a sip of his juice. "It's really no big deal. I mean, we're supposed to help each other, right?" David paused, the simplicity of Lucas's words making him feel almost foolish. His entire life had been built on the idea that nothing came for free, that every action had a price, a return, an angle. Yet here was Lucas, treating kindness as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lucas's mom set a plate in front of David, scrambled eggs and toast. "It's not much, but you're welcome to it," she said, offering him a gentle smile. David looked down at the plate, then back up at her, swallowing. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. It's more than enough." They ate in silence for a few moments, the clinking of forks on plates the only sound. David kept glancing at Lucas, observing the way the boy interacted with his mom, the warmth in his eyes. It was such a stark contrast to the way his own household had felt lately, cold, distant, more like a transaction than a family. Lucas looked up suddenly, his eyes catching David's. "So, what's it like, being successful and all that?" David paused, chewing thoughtfully. "It's busy," he said finally. "A lot of meetings, a lot of responsibility." He looked at Lucas, seeing the curiosity in his eyes. "I guess most people think it's all fancy parties and luxury, but it can be pretty lonely." Lucas nodded slowly. "I get that. I mean, people probably see the fancy car and think you've got it all, right?" David smiled slightly, a bitter edge to it. "Yeah, something like that." He looked down at his plate, pushing the eggs around. "Sometimes I think I've lost sight of what really matters. The things that make life worth it." Lucas tilted his head, considering. "Maybe you just need a reminder." He smiled again, that same open, genuine smile. "Helping someone, being there, it feels good, right?" David blinked, taken aback. He set his fork down, nodding slowly. Yeah, it does." Lucas's mom cleared her throat softly, breaking the moment. "We don't have much, but we try to help when we can. It's how my mom raised me, and it's how I'm raising Lucas." David nodded, glancing at her, then back at Lucas. "You've done a good job," he said, his voice sincere. "Lucas is a good kid." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind David wasn't used to. He leaned back in his chair, letting himself relax for the first time in what felt like a long time. It wasn't about the luxury or the material things. It was just about being there, sharing a meal, connecting. As the meal finished, Lucas stood up, taking David's empty plate and stacking it with his own. "So, what now, mister? You going to be all right?" he asked, a teasing smile playing on his lips. David let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "I think so." Then he hesitated and looked Lucas in the eye. "I really do," something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wanted to do something for someone, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. Because it meant something. David drove in silence, the hum of the engine a soft background to his thoughts. The road ahead didn't seem as long or as isolating as it had the day before. It was as though the weight had lifted, replaced by something lighter, something full of possibility. When he arrived back at his house, David sat in the car for a moment, watching the driveway, his hand resting on the steering wheel. He wasn't sure yet what this change would look like, but he knew he was ready for it. The house was quiet as he stepped out of the SUV. He took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on his skin, and walked inside, a sense of resolve forming within him. Maybe this was the start of something better after all. Family or the boy he was looking for. Despite the lack of concrete information, David didn't feel discouraged. The drive inside him hadn't dimmed. He was determined, and for once, the uncertainty felt like a challenge he was willing to face. He spent the rest of the morning driving around the area, talking to locals, asking if they knew Lucas or his family. Some looked at him like he was crazy, others just shrugged, but David didn't mind. He was used to being patient when he had a goal, even if it felt like it was getting harder to find the answers he wanted. Around midday, he made one last stop at a small convenience store on the edge of town. The woman behind the counter recognized Lucas's name immediately. "Oh, that boy," she said, her face softening. "He's a good kid, always helping others. I think he lives just a bit further down the road, near the old mill." David's heart quickened. Finally, a lead. He thanked the woman and was on his way, his mind racing as he drove toward the address she'd given him. It didn't take long before he reached the old mill area. The houses here were small, some in disrepair, but there was a certain charm to the quiet, slower pace of life. He drove down the dirt road, slowing as he passed the small homes. And then he saw it. A small, modest house sat nestled between overgrown trees, a porch swing hanging from the front. It was nothing like the lavish homes he was used to, but it felt real, genuine, just like the people living in it. David stopped the car, his heart pounding in his chest. He got out, his mind still swirling with thoughts about what he would do next, about what he could offer. He approached the house slowly, taking a deep breath before knocking on the door. A few moments passed, and the door creaked open. Lucas stood there, surprise flickering across his face before it melted into a smile. "Hey, mister," he said. "What brings you back?" David smiled back, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope. Round of breakfast?" David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not exactly," he said, his voice carrying a hint of warmth. "I actually came by to talk to you. About what happened the other day. I still can't get it out of my head." Lucas looked a little confused but intrigued. "What do you mean?" David took a breath, trying to gather his thoughts. "I've been thinking about what you said, about helping people just because you can. It's not something I'm used to. I mean, in my world, everything has a price, you know? You do something for someone, and they owe you something in return. But what you did, it was different. It felt right. And I guess I want to understand why." Lucas stood there, silent for a moment, clearly processing David's words. Finally, he shrugged, his smile never fading. "I don't really think about it that way," he said simply. "I guess helping's just what you do. It's how my mom raised me. We don't have a lot, but we share what we can." David nodded slowly, letting the simplicity of Lucas's words sink in. It felt like the pieces were starting to fall into place, but it still didn't fully make sense to him. "I think I've spent too much of my life trying to hold on to what I have, thinking that if I didn't, I'd lose everything. But you just give. And it doesn't feel like you're losing anything." Lucas's mom stepped forward, her hands still busy with a dish from the kitchen. "We just try to live our lives the best we can, that's all. It's not about having a lot of money or fancy things. It's about being there for people." David stared at her, struck by the honesty and calm in her voice. The contrast between their worlds couldn't have been starker, yet here they were, having a conversation that David would have never expected. "I know I'm not from around here," David said, the words coming more freely now. "But I want to help. I want to do something real. Something that makes a difference, not just for me, but for people like you, people who don't get the opportunities that others do." Lucas and his mother exchanged a quick glance, both of them a little surprised by David's words. "You don't have to do anything for us," Lucas said softly. "But if you really want to help, maybe you could just start by being here. Helping others. Like you helped me." David smiled, feeling the weight of his earlier frustration begin to lift. Maybe it wasn't about big gestures or grand actions. Maybe it was just about showing up, offering a hand when it was needed, and seeing where that took him. "I think I can do that," David said, feeling more certain now. "I think I can do that. With what we have." David smiled back, feeling a mixture of gratitude and humility. "I know. And I won't forget that," he said. "But I still want to do something. I want to give back in a way that feels right. So, I'll be in touch soon, and we'll figure out the details." As David turned to leave, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The unease from the previous days, that constant feeling of being disconnected, seemed to be fading. He had offered something not because he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to. It felt different. This time, it wasn't about what he could take from the world, but what he could give. Lucas waved as David climbed into his SUV. "Take care, mister," Lucas called out, his grin wide. "You too, Lucas," David replied, watching as the boy and his mom stood in the doorway, a quiet sense of understanding passing between them. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, looking back at the house, and realized that the nagging feeling of incompleteness had transformed. It wasn't about luxury or success. It was about the connection, the simple act of being there for someone, just because you could. David drove home that afternoon with a renewed sense of purpose, feeling the weight of his previous frustrations lift a little more with each passing mile. He didn't know exactly where this journey would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. And no matter how small the steps seemed, they were his steps to take as he stepped aside, gesturing for David to enter. We were just getting ready for the day. You want some coffee? David smiled, appreciating the offer. That sounds great, he said, stepping into the modest home once more. The familiar scent of coffee and the comforting hum of activity filled the air. It was simple, but it felt real, unlike the sterile environment of his own home, where everything was polished but lacked warmth. Lucas's mom greeted him with a nod as she moved around the kitchen. Thank you for coming back, Mr. David, she said, her voice soft but warm. It's my pleasure, David replied. I've brought a few people with me. We're going to take a look at the roof and a few other things. Just to get started, Lucas's eyes lit up. That's awesome. I wasn't sure what we were going to do about the roof. It leaks pretty bad when it rains. David nodded, feeling a surge of determination. We'll get it sorted out. It might take a little time, but we'll make sure it's done right. As they talked, David could feel the genuine connection forming, something he hadn't experienced in years. The work ahead was more than just physical labor. It was an opportunity to create something lasting, to leave behind more than just an improvement to a house. It was about building trust, offering help without strings attached, and being part of something meaningful. Coffee's ready, Lucas's mom called from the kitchen, and David followed her into the small dining area, where they all sat down together. As they drank their coffee and talked about the upcoming repairs, David felt the weight of his previous frustrations slip away. This was where he was meant to be, doing something that mattered, even if it was just one small act at a time. When the crew arrived, David gave them instructions, overseeing the work with care. As the day went on, Lucas and his mom watched from the porch, grateful but not expecting anything more. They were just happy to have help. For David, the experience was a revelation, a reminder of what it meant to give without expecting anything in return, to be a part of a community, and to share the weight of life's struggles. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, David stood back and looked at the house. It wasn't a mansion, and it wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been. And for the first time in a long while, David felt truly fulfilled. David made his way over to Greg, nodding and greeting. How's everything looking? Greg grunted, scratching his head. We've got a few things to work on today. The roof's gonna take some time, especially with the leaks. We'll need to replace a few sections and make sure the structure's sound before we can patch it up properly. He gestured to the tools and materials laid out, then gave a thumbs up to the workers who were starting to move things into position. David nodded. Sounds like a plan. Make sure we're thorough, but also respectful of their space. This is important for them, not just as repairs, but as a way of showing them they're worth investing in. Greg looked at him, a bit surprised but nodded slowly. Got it. We'll take our time, no shortcuts. David turned back to Lucas, who was watching with interest. This will take a few days, but I'll check in every morning. You and your mom can let us know if anything else comes up, okay? Lucas grinned. Yeah, sure thing, mister. I don't know how to thank you for all this. This more than I expected. David smiled down at him, feeling a sense of pride. You don't have to thank me, Lucas. You've already given me something important. A reminder of what really matters. With that, David watched as the workers got to work, hammering and sawing. It was a long day of effort and progress, but as the sun began to set, David felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about fixing a house, it was about building something more. Trust, connection, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. By the time he left that evening, he felt a warmth in his chest, a feeling of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. As he drove back to his own house, his thoughts were clear, and for once, the nagging sense of incompleteness was gone. He had found something real in the simplest of gestures. Something meaningful. Understand, Mr. David. We really do appreciate it. Not just the repairs, but the time, the effort, the thoughtfulness you're putting into all this. It's something rare, especially these days. David looked at her, feeling something stir in his chest. I think I needed this more than you know, he said quietly, meeting her gaze. I've spent so much time focused on things that didn't really matter. things I thought I needed. But I'm realizing now that it's the connections, the small acts of kindness, that make a real difference. Clara's smile deepened, her eyes softening. You're not alone in that, she said. We all get caught up in the wrong things sometimes. David felt a sense of peace settle over him, something that had been missing for years. The noise of the world around him, his career, his ambitions, the constant chase for more, had drowned out what was truly important. But here, in this small house, with Lucas and his family, he was learning what it meant to be present, to give for the sake of giving. Is there anything else we can do while we're here? David asked, looking around at the workers getting to work on the roof and checking the rest of the yard. Clara gave a thoughtful glance, then shook her head. No, just keep doing what you're doing. You're already doing more than we could ever ask for. David nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. I'll be here every day until it's done. And after that, we'll see what else we can do. I think you deserve a lot more than just repairs. Lucas grinned up at David, still holding that playful edge in his expression. You know, mister, you're all right. David smiled back, grateful for the easy acceptance the boy had shown him from the start. Thanks, Lucas, he said, feeling the sincerity behind the words. It means a lot to hear that. As the workers continued with their tasks and the sun began to climb higher in the sky, David felt a quiet sense of fulfillment settle in. The house would be fixed. It would be made safer, more comfortable, and maybe even a little more like the home it deserved to be. But more than that, David had begun to understand the true value of community, of giving, not for what you might get in return, but because it was the right thing to do. And as the day passed, he realized that in helping Lucas, in helping this family, he was beginning to heal the parts of himself that had been lost to years of focusing on the wrong things. To tell his mom the progress. He felt a quiet sense of pride settle over him, watching the small improvements take shape. The roof wasn't perfect yet, but it was solid for the first time in a long while. The kitchen would be warmer, more reliable. It wasn't about perfection, it was about providing something real, something lasting. Lucas came back outside, his face alight with excitement. It looks so much better already, mister. The roof doesn't leak anymore, and the pipes don't sound like they're gonna burst. David chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. Glad to hear it, but it's not done yet. We'll keep at it. Lucas's mom came out onto the porch, a proud smile on her face as she surveyed the work. Thank you again, Mr. David. I know you've given more than just time and money. You've given your heart. David felt a lump form in his throat. It's not about what I've given, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. It's about what I've learned from you all. You've reminded me of things I forgot, how important it is to help others, to connect, to be present. Clara looked at him thoughtfully, her expression softening. Sometimes we need a little reminder, don't we? David nodded, his eyes drifting toward the work still ahead. Yeah, we do. Lucas ran back outside, holding a small box in his hands. Hey, mister. I saved this for you. He handed David the box with a grin. David looked at the box in confusion but opened it carefully. Inside was a small hand-carved wooden figure of a man with a raised arm, as if waving. What's this? He asked, touched by the gesture. It's a gift, Lucas said simply. For helping us. It's not much, but it's from the heart. David blinked, feeling the weight of the gift far more than its physical size. He held it carefully, appreciating the thought behind it more than anything. Thank you, Lucas, he said softly. This means more to me than you know. As the day wound down, the crew packed up their tools, and David exchanged a few words with Greg about the next steps. The workers would be back tomorrow, and the project would continue. But for now, there was a calm sense of fulfillment in the air, a feeling that this day had meant something. Not just because of the repairs or the physical labor, but because of the connections made and the moments shared. As David climbed back into his SUV to head home, he glanced back at the house one last time. It had begun to look like a place of safety, a place that could withstand storms. But more than that, it had become a symbol of something larger, a reminder of what truly mattered: family, community, and the quiet power of helping one another, no matter how small the act. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. And maybe Just maybe, it would be a future filled with more of these small, meaningful acts, each one building on the last, until the walls he had spent so long constructing finally began to come down. Stepped out of his SUV, feeling the cool morning air against his face, and took a moment to look around. There was something grounding about the scene before him, the simplicity of it all. The house, still modest, now had a stronger presence, a renewed sense of hope woven into its walls. Lucas greeted him with his usual wide grin, practically bouncing on his heels. "Morning, mister. We ready to get this place looking even better today?" David chuckled, returning the smile. "Absolutely. Let's get to work, Lucas." As they entered the house, Clara was already busy, making breakfast in the kitchen, the warm scent of eggs and toast drifting through the air. She greeted David with a nod, her expression soft but full of gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. David. It's not just the repairs. It's the way you've changed things for us." David shook his head, brushing off the praise. "I'm just doing what I should have done a long time ago." Lucas stepped up beside him, looking eagerly at the tools and supplies they had ready for the day. "What do we start with?" "We'll begin with the floorboards in the living room," David explained, leading him into the room where the worn wood had long ago lost its shine. "Once those are done, we'll tackle the plumbing. It won't be quick, but we'll make it last." As the workday progressed, David found himself feeling more and more invested. He wasn't just supervising anymore. He was actively involved, hauling boards, helping with measurements, even lending a hand with the plumbing where he could. It was hard, physical work, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. The sweat on his brow, the ache in his muscles, those were reminders that he was making a difference, however small, in a way that mattered. Lucas didn't seem to tire, running back and forth between David and the workers, eager to help in any way he could. Clara, though quieter, had a steady presence, her small gestures of gratitude and encouragement giving David a sense of belonging he hadn't expected. By the end of the day, the floorboards had been replaced and the plumbing was functioning properly. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. And more than that, it was a start. The house was already beginning to feel different, warmer, more solid, more like a true home. As the workers began packing up, David took a step back to survey the progress. He felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment, yet also something else, something more profound. He wasn't just repairing a house. He was healing a part of himself, reconnecting with a world he had long ignored. The satisfaction wasn't from the work itself, but from the connections it had brought about. The small, quiet moments of shared laughter, the sense of community, the realization that doing something good for others could fill a part of him he hadn't even known was empty. Lucas appeared beside him, looking up at the house with wide eyes. "It's starting to look like a real home, huh?" David nodded, his voice thoughtful. "Yeah, it is." Clara stepped out from the porch, her arms crossed in a relaxed stance. "Thank you, Mr. David, for everything. We never expected anything like this." David smiled, but it was soft, almost wistful. "You don't have to thank me. I'm the one who's learned something from all of you." He glanced at Lucas, who was beaming. "You've shown me that the things that matter aren't always the ones we can buy or fix with money. It's about the people, the connections, the small acts of kindness." Lucas grinned up at him. "I think you're starting to get it, mister." David chuckled, tousling Lucas's hair. "Yeah, I think I am." As the workers finished up and the day began to wind down, David took one last look at the house. It wasn't the grand mansion he was used to, but it was something far more valuable. It was a place built on love, community, and the quiet power of helping one another. He climbed into his SUV, ready to head home, but as he drove away, there was no sense of emptiness, no nagging feeling of something missing. Instead, he felt a quiet, steady fulfillment, the kind that comes from knowing you're on the right path, no matter how long it may take to find your way. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. "Thank you again for everything," Clara said, setting the last plate on the table and sitting down across from him. "It's hard to put into words just how much this means to us." David smiled, his gaze shifting between her and Lucas. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice sincere. "I'm the one who should be grateful. You've reminded me of things I've forgotten, things that matter more than anything I've spent so much time chasing? Lucas piped up, his mouth full of eggs. I told you, mister, you're not so bad once you get to know you. David chuckled, ruffling Lucas's hair again. Yeah, I guess I'm not as tough as I thought. Clara gave them both a knowing smile, her eyes warm. It's easy to get caught up in what we think we need, what we think we're supposed to want. But sometimes, it's the simple things that mean the most. David nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It was a reminder of everything he had been overlooking in his rush to achieve. In this little house, with its humble kitchen and worn floors, he found something richer than anything money could buy, a connection. A bond that didn't require grand gestures, just the willingness to be present and share. As they finished breakfast, David felt the familiar feeling of purpose settle over him again. Today was another day of work on the house. The crew would be arriving soon to continue the repairs, and he was more than ready to dive back in. But it was more than just fixing the house now, it was about making a difference in their lives and in his own. How about we get to work? David said, pushing back his chair with a grin. There's still plenty to do, and I'm not about to let you guys have all the fun. Lucas jumped up from the table, already excited. Let's do it. I bet we can get a lot done today. David followed him outside, where the sun was just starting to rise higher, casting a warm glow over the yard. It was a good day, the beginning of something real. And as he stepped onto the porch, ready to continue working alongside them, he couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in a long while, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Obligation or charity, David said, his voice steady and sincere. It's about giving you the kind of home you deserve. You've shown me what really matters, what real connection looks like, and this is my way of giving back. Clara looked at him, her expression softening, emotions flickering across her face. We've always managed, but to have someone care enough to do this for us, it's more than I can put into words. David smiled, feeling something stir inside him, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing for so long. It's not just about the house. It's about helping one another, no matter where we come from. Sometimes we just need a little push to remember that. Lucas bounced on his feet, his excitement almost contagious. I can't believe it. This place is going to look amazing. You really think we could get all of that done? David chuckled at Lucas's enthusiasm, feeling a warmth spread through him. I think we can. And I'll be here every step of the way. It won't be quick, but it'll be worth it. Clara stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. Thank you, David. You've already done so much for us, and it's more than we ever expected. You've given us more than just repairs. You've given us hope. David nodded, feeling something deep settle within him. It wasn't just about the physical changes to the house. It was about the shift in their lives and his own. I'm just getting started, he said softly. And I mean that. This house, this family, what we do here, it matters. Lucas grinned, his face lighting up with joy. You're really going to fix everything. I'm gonna have my own room. David laughed, the sound warm and genuine. That's the plan, Lucas. As Clara and Lucas looked at him with gratitude, David realized that the journey he was on had become something far greater than he could have ever imagined. What began as a simple act of kindness was transforming into a powerful reminder of what it meant to truly connect with others, to give and receive in ways that transcended money or status. And with each day of work, each small improvement to their home, David knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for them, but for him as well. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Let's take our time and do it right. The goal is to make this place as comfortable and lasting as possible. Greg nodded, looking over the house. We'll get started on the new plans tomorrow. I'll get the team prepped for the bigger work. Kitchen, plumbing, floors. It'll take a few phases, but we'll keep it moving. David appreciated Greg's no-nonsense attitude and the steady confidence of the crew. Good. I'm counting on you all. He felt a sense of calm now, more sure of his path than he had in a long time. As the workers began unpacking their tools and getting organized, David turned back to the house, his gaze shifting to the porch where Clara and Lucas were now standing, watching the progress. Lucas was already full of questions, eager to see what would happen next. David gave them a nod, walking over to join them. I just talked to Greg, he said. They're going to start on the kitchen today. We'll get the plumbing sorted, and after that, we'll focus on the floors and your room, Lucas." Lucas's eyes lit up again. "Really, mister? You're gonna fix everything?" David laughed, nodding. "Yep. Everything. One thing at a time. But I promise we'll get it done. And you'll have a room you can be proud of." Clara smiled softly, her voice carrying a mix of pride and gratitude. "I can't believe it. You've really taken this on, haven't you?" David looked back at her, his gaze steady. "You've taught me something important. That the little things, the real things, are what matter. I think I'm just trying to make up for lost time. You all deserve more than I can give, but this is what I can do right now." She nodded, the silent understanding between them deepening. "I think you've already given us more than we could have imagined." The day passed with a steady rhythm, the crew working hard while David found himself becoming more involved, helping with small tasks and keeping an eye on the progress. With every nail, every piece of drywall, and every beam that was secured, David felt like he was building something more than just a house. He was building connections, reparations of a sort. As the sun began to dip lower, the work slowed down for the day. The crew cleaned up, and David stood at the edge of the yard, looking at the house in the soft light. It wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, but it was starting to feel different. More hopeful. More like a home. Lucas came running up to him, excitement bubbling over. "Mister, you really did it. The roof's fixed. The kitchen's better. My room's next." David grinned, squatting down to his level. "And I can't wait to see your face when it's done. We're in this together, Lucas. All of us." Clara came out too, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, David. For everything. We'll never forget this." David looked at them both, his heart full. "I'll never forget it either. This is the kind of work that matters." At Lucas, who was standing near the porch, his face glowing with excitement as he chattered away about his plans for his new room. The sight warmed David's heart in a way he hadn't expected. "I'm glad to see him so happy," David said quietly, looking back at Clara. "He deserves it." Clara's smile softened, her eyes full of appreciation. "He does. We both do. But you've given us more than we ever thought possible." David could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the weight of years spent managing on their own, not wanting to rely on anyone. But there was something different now, a shift that made him feel more connected to them than he ever had to anyone. This wasn't just about helping someone in need, it was about restoring a sense of hope, a sense of belonging. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." "You don't need to," David replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been looking for something meaningful to do for a long time. Helping you, your family, it's more than just fixing up a house. It's giving back what I've lost." They stood there for a moment, the sound of the workers finishing up for the day in the background, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the scene. David had come here thinking he was just helping with repairs, but he realized now that what he was building wasn't just a house. It was trust, understanding, and a deep, unexpected bond. Lucas skipped over, his excitement hardly contained. "Mr. David, I can't wait to get my own room. Maybe a bunk bed, with a desk and a window looking out at the trees." David chuckled at Lucas's enthusiasm. "We'll make it happen. Every part of it. Just give me a little time." "Thanks, mister." Lucas beamed before running off to tell his mom about all the new ideas for his room. Clara smiled at David again, a look of quiet pride on her face. "Thank you for doing this. Not just for us, but for yourself too. I can see it, David. You're doing more than just fixing things. You're changing something inside." David met her gaze, the truth of her words settling deep within him. "I think you're right. This is something I needed to do. It's not just about the house. It's about building a better life. For all of us." With that, they watched Lucas running around in the yard, his laughter carrying through the air, as the first signs of a new chapter began to take root. House, now filled with the sounds of progress and possibility. The broken floors were being replaced, the walls were being rebuilt, and the roof, once a major concern, was being reinforced. He could already see the changes taking shape, the house becoming more than just a structure. It was transforming into a home, a place of warmth and stability, Not just for Clara and Lucas, but for himself as well. "Feels good, doesn't it?" David said, his voice quiet, but full of meaning. "To see something come to life like this?" Clara nodded, her eyes glistening as she watched the crew work. "Yes, it feels different. In the best way possible." David smiled at her words, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment he hadn't known he was missing. He had thought he could find purpose in business deals and boardrooms, but now, standing here with Clara, watching the transformation unfold, he realized how wrong he had been. This was real. This was meaningful. "It's not just about the house," David said softly, his gaze drifting to where Lucas was helping carry supplies, his youthful enthusiasm infectious. "It's about giving people the chance to feel safe, to feel like they belong. To build something that lasts." Clara turned to him, her smile warm and sincere. "You're right, Mr. David. This means more than just the repairs. You've shown us that." David felt a surge of emotion, something new and unfamiliar settling in his chest. A feeling of connection, something he had been searching for, but never truly found. He had built walls around himself for so long, thinking that keeping people out would keep him safe. But now, with Clara, Lucas, and the workers around him, he felt more at home than he ever had in his entire life. "I think," David said, his voice steady, "that I've finally found something I want to protect. Something worth working for." Clara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You've already done more than enough. You've already given us a chance to start over, to build a future. That's more than we could have asked for." David looked out at the worksite again, feeling the weight of their words, but also the promise of what was to come. This house, this family, this community, it was his now. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that he had truly found his place. At him across the yard, his curiosity piqued by the excitement in Lucas's voice. The boy led him over to a section of the house where the floorboards had been replaced, pointing eagerly at the new, solid wood that now covered the living room. "Look, mister. The floor's all fixed. It's not creaky anymore." Lucas beamed, his pride evident in his voice. He looked up at David, eyes wide with enthusiasm. "You think it looks good?" David crouched down, inspecting the work. It was simple, but it was sturdy, and that was exactly what this house needed. "It looks great, Lucas," David said, standing up and ruffling his hair. "It's going to make a huge difference for you and your mom." Lucas grinned even wider, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "I can't wait for it to be all done. And then I can have a Rayal bed, and maybe a desk for my homework, and..." He paused for a moment, then lowered his voice as if sharing a secret. "And I want to help paint my room too." "That would be awesome, right?" David chuckled, his heart warming at Lucas's excitement. "I think that sounds like a great plan, buddy. You've earned it." Lucas's eyes sparkled with hope. "Thanks, mister. I really like that you're here helping us. I don't think anyone's ever done something like this before." David's smile faltered for just a moment, struck by the sincerity in Lucas's words. He had helped people before, but it had always been in a transactional way. He'd offered his money, his resources, but never his time, never his heart. And now, standing here with Lucas, surrounded by the progress of the house, David realized that this was something entirely different. This wasn't just about fixing a house. It was about giving this family and himself a new beginning. "You're welcome, Lucas," David said, his voice low but filled with meaning. "I'm happy to help. And you know what? I'm glad I'm here too." Lucas beamed up at him. "I'm glad too." He ran off, calling over his shoulder, "I'm gonna get more boards, be right back." David watched him go, his chest swelling with something unfamiliar. It wasn't just the work that mattered, or the renovations. It was the connection. The hope that was now a part of this house, and a part of his life. Clara, who had been watching them from the porch, stepped down to join him. She gave him a soft, grateful smile as she approached. "He's a good kid, isn't he?" David said, his eyes following Lucas as he worked. Clara nodded, her eyes reflecting both pride and a quiet sadness. He's been through a lot, but he always tries to stay positive. It's not easy, but I'm proud of him every day." David turned back to her, his voice sincere. "You've done an amazing job, Clara. You've given him a strong foundation, and I can see it in the way he helps, in the way he cares. He's got a good heart, and that's because of you." Clara's eyes misted once again, and she blinked, quickly wiping away a tear. "Thank you, Mr. David. You don't know how much that means to me." David felt a lump in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt like he was a part of something that truly mattered. "It's the least I can do," he said quietly. "You've helped me more than you know." Nearby, watching the scene unfold with a smile that spoke of both gratitude and contentment, David joined them, sitting beside Clara and grabbing a sandwich. The familiar warmth of the house and the company was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environments he was used to. It wasn't just the food that felt like a feast, it was the connection, the community that surrounded him. Lucas, with his boundless energy, was still talking animatedly, pointing to the windows and discussing how much warmer the house would be. David chuckled, listening as the boy spoke with such enthusiasm, his youthful optimism infectious. He'd seen a lot of things in his life, but this kind of simple, honest joy was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Clara looked at him, catching his gaze as she set down her lemonade. "It's nice to see you so engaged," she said softly, a gentle smile on her lips. "I don't think I've seen you like this before." David looked at her, his voice thoughtful. "Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time focused on things that don't really matter. But this feels real." Clara's smile widened slightly, but she didn't say anything, as if understanding exactly what he meant without needing further explanation. They sat in silence for a moment, the laughter of the workers and the occasional burst of Lucas's excited chatter filling the space around them. After lunch, the work continued, and the renovation started to take shape more visibly. The new windows were being installed, the plumbing was finally being fully fixed, and the floorboards were replaced with new, sturdy materials. David found himself more involved in the process, even if it meant getting his hands dirty. He didn't mind. It was work that mattered. As the crew worked, David observed Clara and Lucas. Lucas was already talking about the future, about how he wanted his room to be a place where he could study and relax, and Clara seemed to listen with a quiet pride, knowing her son's dreams were starting to feel within reach. Later that afternoon, when the crew called it a day, Clara walked over to David, her face more serious than usual. "Mr. David, there's something I've been thinking about," she said, her voice low but steady. David looked at her, giving her his full attention. "What is it, Clara?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his. "I've been thinking about everything you've done for us, for Lucas, and I just want to make sure you know, it's not lost on us. We've never had anyone do something like this before." David shook his head, his voice sincere. "You don't need to thank me, Clara. I'm just glad to be able to help. I meant what I said, the work we're doing here, it's as much for me as it is for you." Clara smiled softly, her gaze softening. "Well, you've certainly made a difference in more ways than one. Not just with the house, but with us. You've reminded us that there are people who care, that we're not alone in this." David felt a quiet warmth spread through him at her words. He wasn't sure when exactly it had happened, but somewhere along the way, this house, this family, had become more important to him than he ever anticipated. "I'm glad to hear that," David said, his voice a little rough. He cleared his throat, trying to push back the unexpected emotion welling up inside him. "I really am." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We're grateful, Mr. David. Truly." David gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment settle over him. This wasn't just about fixing a house anymore. It was about the connections he had made, the growth he had experienced. For the first time in a long time, David didn't feel the weight of his past or the cold distance that had once defined his life. He felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the house and the yard, David knew that the work wasn't finished yet, but it was well on its way. And more importantly, he knew that this wasn't just a job, it was the beginning of something that would last much longer than any renovation. The sounds of the crew working in the background, the air warm with the late afternoon sun. David glanced at Lucas, who was now helping one of the workers carry a bag of cement, his face alight with purpose. Clara's voice broke the silence again, quiet but sincere. "You know, Mr. David, I think you're right. People can get caught up in all sorts of things: work, money, achievements. But when you stop and look around, you realize the real treasures are the people in your life, the connections you make. She paused, her gaze lingering on Lucas. He's my everything. And now, with all your help, I can see him having the future he deserves. David nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He had heard the words many times before from other people, but hearing them from Clara, seeing the genuine depth of her feelings for her son, made him understand in a way he never had before. I think Lucas is going to do amazing things, David said softly, his voice carrying a quiet confidence. Clara smiled, a faint laugh escaping her lips. He already is. He's changed our lives more than he knows. David's thoughts lingered on Clara's words. Change. That was the one thing that had been so elusive for him for so long. Until now. This small home, this family, had changed him more in the past few days than his whole life of pursuing wealth and status ever had. He had been so focused on building walls around himself, on keeping people at arm's length, that he never noticed the value of simply being present. Being part of something real. Something grounded in love and mutual care. The crew finished their work for the day, and soon they were packing up to head home. David turned to Clara, his mind already made up about what he wanted to do next. Clara, he began, his voice steady, I know I said I wanted to help with the house, and we're making great progress. But I think there's more I can do, for you and for Lucas. Clara looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly, as if unsure of where this was going. I want to help make sure that you have everything you need, not just for now but for the future. I don't know how much you've thought about it, but I'm willing to help with the mortgage, to make sure you have stability for years to come. If you're open to it. The offer hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, Clara didn't speak. Her eyes searched his face, trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. David met her gaze, his expression unyielding. You don't have to worry about how things are going to turn out. I want to give you that peace of mind. Clara stood still, her hands clenched at her sides, before she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. David, I don't know what to say. I've spent my whole life figuring things out on my own. It's hard to imagine letting someone in like this. David smiled, his tone reassuring. I get it. But sometimes, letting someone help isn't about weakness. It's about trust. And if you trust me, I promise I won't let you down. Clara hesitated again, her lips trembling slightly, but this time, she nodded. Thank you. I'll think about it. But that means a lot to us, more than you know. David nodded back, relief flooding through him. He didn't want to push her, but the decision felt like the right thing to do. It was no longer about what he could give, it was about what they could all build together. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the house, David stood next to Clara, the evening quiet around them, but filled with the promise of new beginnings. He had come here to help, to fix a house, but he was leaving with so much more. A sense of purpose, a connection to people who had made him realize that the true value in life wasn't in what you achieved alone, but in the lives you touched along the way. Fulfillment that he hadn't expected. The hum of the engine was a soft backdrop to his thoughts, but his mind was not on the road ahead or the work still to be done. It was on the people he'd met, the connections he'd forged, and how much he had grown in such a short time. As the city skyline appeared in the distance, David felt a profound shift within himself. For so long, he had measured his worth in terms of success, wealth, and the distance he could place between himself and the life he had once known. But here, in this small house with its worn walls and sagging roof, he had found something more. Purpose. Connection. Belonging ***. He hadn't expected that the simple act of helping would change him so much. But it had, and for the first time in years, David realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been missing the point all along. The day had ended with a quiet sense of completion. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, David could see the future differently. It was no longer about what he could do for them, it was about what they had done for him. They had shown him what it meant to be part of something real, something lasting. As he drove through the streets of the city, heading toward his home, he thought of Clara, of Lucas, of all the moments they had shared in just a few short days. He thought about the unfinished house, still full of potential, just like he felt now. The work would continue, but so would this new journey. David didn't know where it would take him, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. Stepped onto the porch, her eyes bright as she greeted David with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. David," she said, her voice still soft from sleep. "You're up early today. What's the plan?" David nodded, his excitement contained but evident. "I wanted to make sure we stay on track. We're getting close to wrapping up, but I've got a special surprise planned for today." Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but didn't press further, allowing David to keep his plans a mystery. Lucas, however, was already bouncing with curiosity, unable to hold back his questions. "A surprise? What kind of surprise?" he asked, eyes wide and full of energy. David chuckled. "You'll see soon enough, Lucas. Just trust me, today's going to be a good day." As the workers began their tasks, David moved around the yard, checking in on the progress. The living room had new floorboards, the plumbing was fully functional, and the roof was solid. They had worked tirelessly over the past week, and it was beginning to show. But today, David had something that would make this place feel even more like home. Clara joined him, standing on the porch, watching as the crew worked in sync. "I can't believe how much has changed in such a short time," she said, her voice filled with awe. "You've really done more than I could have ever imagined." David met her gaze, his expression softening. "I'm just getting started. This is for you and for Lucas. It's the least I can do." The sound of hammers and drills filled the air as the crew worked, but Clara's focus stayed on David. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice hesitant. "I know I said I didn't want to take charity, but what you've done for us, it's beyond anything I could have asked for. I just want you to know how much it means." David smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "You don't have to thank me, Clara. It's about making things right. Sometimes, helping others is the best way to help yourself." Lucas ran up again, his face filled with excitement. "Mister, the workers are putting in the last of the new windows today. Are we really going to finish today?" David looked down at the boy, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, Lucas. We're going to finish today. And then, we're going to do something special." He winked at the boy, making him beam with anticipation. Lucas pulled his mom over to him, whispering excitedly about what he thought the surprise might be. Clara smiled at the scene, her heart full as she looked between Lucas and David, grateful for everything that had changed in the past few days. As the morning turned to afternoon, the final touches were made. The house was nearly complete. David, along with the crew, moved with precision, finishing the last details of the renovation. Greg, the lead worker, gave David a thumbs up as they finished installing the new flooring in the living room. With everything in place, David stepped outside, his heart beating faster as he turned toward Clara and Lucas. "Okay, you two. Are you ready for the surprise?" David asked, his voice light but full of excitement. Lucas's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "What is it?" he asked, almost jumping in place. David motioned toward the side of the house where a large, wrapped object stood. It had been hidden under a tarp all morning, and now, it was ready. Clara looked at David, her brow furrowed slightly. "What's this?" David smiled, leading them both toward the surprise. "It's something I've been working on for a while now, something I think will really make a difference around here." With a swift motion, he pulled the tarp off to reveal a brand new swing set, complete with a slide and a set of swings. It was bright and sturdy, the perfect addition to the backyard, a place where Lucas could play, dream, and enjoy being a kid in a home that was finally his. Lucas's eyes grew wide, and a smile stretched across his face as he rushed forward. "A swing set? For me?" he asked in disbelief. David nodded. "Yes, Lucas. It's yours." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her hand flying to her mouth in surprise. "David, this is too much," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. David looked at her, his expression gentle. "It's not too much. It's just what you both deserve. A home that's not just a place to live, but a place where you can thrive and be happy." Lucas immediately jumped onto the swing, kicking his legs to get it moving, laughing as he soared back and forth. The sound of his joy was contagious, and Clara couldn't help but smile, her eyes never leaving the boy. David stood back, watching the scene unfold. He knew that this was more than just a house renovation. This was the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. A chapter filled with hope, possibility, and the kind of love that only comes when you open your heart to others. As the sun set on the freshly renovated home, David felt a deep sense of contentment. This wasn't just about fixing walls and floors, it was about fixing hearts, rebuilding connections, and giving people the space to grow. And in that moment, David knew that, for the first time in years, he was exactly where he was meant to be. And full of life. The once worn-out walls now stood proudly, with fresh paint on the exterior and the interior exuding warmth and comfort. The new floorboards gleamed in the light, and every corner seemed to reflect the care that had gone into it. The kitchen sparkled with its new cabinets, and Lucas's room, now free of leaks, looked like a space where a young boy could dream and grow. David surveyed the progress with a sense of pride, watching the crew wrap up for the day. He glanced over at Clara, who was standing on the porch, her eyes scanning the house with a quiet appreciation. Lucas was running around the yard, playing with a ball, his laughter ringing through the air as he enjoyed the newfound space to roam. David walked over to Clara, who turned to him as he approached. "It looks amazing, Mr. David," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. "I still can't believe it." David nodded, taking a moment to soak in the sight of the house. "It's a lot more than I expected too. But it's not just about the house, it's about you and Lucas. I'm glad I could do this for you." Clara smiled, her eyes softening with gratitude. "You've done so much more than fix a house. You've given us a future. It's hard to explain, but it's a feeling I haven't had in a long time. Thank you." David's chest tightened as he looked at her, the sincerity in her words hitting him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "You're welcome," he said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to make sure you had a place you could truly call home." The workers finished up for the day, packing up their tools and giving David nods of approval. As the last of them drove off, David took a deep breath, feeling a sense of accomplishment that settled deep in his bones. It was time for the surprise. "Clara, Lucas," David called out, looking at both of them. "I've got something I'd like to show you." Lucas looked up from where he was playing, his face immediately lighting up. "What is it, mister? Is it the surprise?" David smiled, feeling his heart swell as he gestured toward the backyard. Clara's curiosity mirrored Lucas's, and they both followed David to the back of the house. When they reached the area where the old shed used to stand, David stopped and pointed. There, standing in the middle of the yard, was a brand new wooden swing set with bright, colorful seats and a sturdy structure built for play. "I thought every home should have a place for the family to play," David said, his voice full of warmth. "I figured this might make the backyard a little more fun." Lucas's eyes went wide as he ran forward, his excitement bubbling over. "A swing set? For real?" he shouted, nearly bouncing off the ground in joy. "This is awesome, mister. Thank you. Thank you." Clara stood still for a moment, her hand resting over her heart as she watched her son. Tears welled up in her eyes, though she quickly wiped them away. "David, this is too much," she whispered, overcome with emotion. "You didn't have to do this." David stepped closer to her, his voice soft but firm. "It's not too much, Clara. It's what you deserve. You've given so much to Lucas, and this is just a small way of showing you both how much you mean to me." Lucas was already climbing onto the swing, his laughter ringing out as he kicked his legs to get the swing moving. Clara couldn't help but smile, her eyes following her son, who was completely absorbed in the joy of the moment. David stood beside her, watching Lucas swing higher and higher, his heart full of pride. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He felt like part of something real, something meaningful. As the sun set behind them, casting a golden hue over the house and yard, Clara turned to David, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You've given us more than I could ever put into words." David smiled, his voice full of sincerity. "You don't have to say anything, Clara. Watching you and Lucas happy is all the thanks I need." They stood together for a long moment, watching Lucas swing on the set, his joy filling the air. It wasn't just the house that had been transformed, it was their lives. And David knew, without a doubt, that this was where he was meant to be. This was the family he'd been looking for all along that can have a little more security in the future. It's a start for his education, his future. I wanted to make sure that no matter what, he has a foundation to build on, something that's his. Clara stood frozen for a moment, the words taking time to sink in. Her eyes searched David's face, disbelief and gratitude flooding her expression. "Mr. David? I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've already done so much for us. This is too much." David shook his head gently. "It's not too much. I want to make sure that Lucas has the opportunities he deserves. And I want him to have the chance to choose his path, whatever it may be." Lucas, who had been watching from the side, ran up, his face lighting up when he saw the envelope in Clara's hands. "What's that, Mom?" he asked, his voice full of curiosity. Clara blinked, trying to fight back the tears that were threatening to fall. "It's something very special, Lucas. Mr. David has given you a gift, something for your future." Lucas's eyes widened. "For me? Really?" He turned to David, his face filled with awe and excitement. "Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr." David smiled warmly, his heart swelling at the joy in Lucas's voice. "You deserve it, kid. You really do." Clara, still processing the enormity of the gesture, looked at David with tear-filled eyes. "I don't even know how to thank you for all of this," she said softly. "You've done more for us than anyone ever has. This is beyond anything we could have imagined." David stepped closer to Clara, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. Just seeing you and Lucas happy is more than enough. You both have brought something into my life that I didn't even know I was missing. And this is just my way of showing you how much I appreciate you both." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. "You've shown us more than we could have ever asked for. You've given us a home, security, and hope. I can't even begin to express how much this means." Lucas, still standing beside them, was practically bouncing on his feet. "I'm gonna be a scientist. Or maybe a pilot. I can go to school for all the stuff I want now, right?" he exclaimed. David chuckled, ruffling Lucas's hair. "You can be whatever you want, Lucas. The world's yours to explore." The three of them stood together, the sun beginning to set behind the house, casting a soft glow over everything. It was a perfect moment, quiet, full of love and promise. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home, and it wasn't just the walls that had been rebuilt, but the future itself. David had found something he hadn't known he was looking for, a sense of purpose, a connection, and a family. Clara looked at David one last time, her heart full. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now. "For everything." David smiled, his heart light. "You don't need to thank me, Clara. This is just the beginning." And as he watched Lucas play in the yard, his laughter carrying through the air, David knew that the future he had once believed was out of reach was now within grasp, not just for him, but for Clara and Lucas too. Was so much more to come, not just for Lucas and Clara, but for him too. They had built something real, something lasting, and as he stood there, the warmth of the setting sun on his face, he realized that it wasn't just about what he could give, it was about what he had gained in return. A sense of purpose, a place in their lives, and a future that was bright, full of possibilities. Lucas looked up at him, eyes filled with excitement and wonder. "Do you really think I can do anything, mister?" he asked, voice full of sincerity. David crouched down to Lucas's level, looking him in the eyes. "I know you can. You're smart, capable, and you have a big heart. Don't ever doubt that you can go as far as you want to go. The world's yours for the taking." Lucas beamed, his smile wide and genuine. "Thanks, mister. I'm gonna make it happen." Clara stepped closer, taking a deep breath, her eyes never leaving David. "I still can't believe it," she murmured. "You've given us so much more than we could have ever imagined. And not just the house, but this future. I don't think words can even express how grateful we are." David stood up, his smile warm. "You don't need to thank me. The real gift is seeing the hope in both of your eyes. That's what I needed to see." Clara nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "You've given us a chance to dream again, to build something better. For Lucas. For me. For all of us." The three of them stood there together, taking in the view of the house and the life they were now sharing. There was laughter in the air, a sense of peace, and the quiet promise of a bright future. It wasn't just about fixing a house. It was about rebuilding a life, creating a foundation of love, trust, and endless potential. David looked at them both, his heart full. "This is just the beginning, Clara. I'll be here to support you every step of the way. Whatever you need, whenever you need it." And as he watched Lucas run around the yard, his energy contagious, David realized that the most important thing he had ever done wasn't something he could buy or build. It was the relationships he had formed, the lives he had touched, and the hope he had helped create. He had found a family that looks incredible. "You've worked hard for this, all of you. It's more than just the repairs, it's a fresh start, a new chapter." Clara looked at him, a smile forming on her lips, though her eyes were misty with emotion. "I never thought we'd have something like this. I didn't think we'd ever be able to fix it up like this." She gestured around the room. "You've given us a chance to build a future we could only dream of." David took a deep breath, his heart swelling. "I didn't do it alone. It was all of us, this team, this family." His gaze softened as he looked around, taking in the warmth of the house. "But it's not just about the house, Clara. It's about what's inside it. The people, the love, the memories you're going to create here." Lucas ran back into the room, his face lighting up. "I love it, mister. This is the best thing ever." He rushed over to show David the new light fixtures in the hallway, his enthusiasm boundless. David chuckled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "I'm so glad you're happy, Lucas. This place is yours now. Take good care of it." Lucas nodded vigorously, then turned to Clara. "Mom, we can finally have people over for dinner. And no more freezing in winter," he said excitedly. Clara laughed, wiping away a stray tear. "Yes, Lucas. We'll have family dinners again, and everything will be just better." She turned back to David, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can never thank you enough for all this." David met her gaze, his voice steady and sincere. "You don't have to thank me. You've already done more than enough by letting me be a part of your lives. I've learned so much from both of you." As the day wore on and the last of the finishing touches were made, David found himself standing outside with Clara and Lucas, the setting sun casting long shadows over the yard. The house behind them looked perfect, a symbol of the journey they had all taken together. Clara looked up at David, her smile soft and content. "So, what's next for you, Mr. David?" she asked gently. David looked at them both, the weight of their questions settling in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure where the road would take him, but he knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, it would be better than what he had been chasing all his life. "I think," David said slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon, "I think I'm going to stick around for a while. You've got a lot of potential, and I want to be part of helping you guys reach it. Whatever you need, I'm here." Lucas bounced on his toes, grinning up at him. "You mean you're not going anywhere? That's awesome." David smiled, his heart full. "No, Lucas. I'm not going anywhere." Clara gave a small, relieved sigh. "Well, I'm glad. We could use someone like you around." David's chest tightened, but this time, it was a feeling of hope, of belonging. He wasn't just offering help. He was building something real, something lasting. As the three of them stood there, looking out at the house and the future ahead, David realized that the most important thing he had found wasn't a place or even a purpose. It was connection. A family. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who had come to mean everything to him, he knew that his life had changed forever, shared in the celebration of the transformation. There was laughter and chatter, a community coming together to welcome them into a new chapter of their lives. David stood back, watching the scene unfold, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Clara, ever the gracious host, welcomed each neighbor with a warm smile, her pride in the house matched only by the pride she felt for her son and the life they were building. Lucas, his energy boundless as always, eagerly showed the neighbors his room, his new desk, and everything that had changed, his excitement contagious. David found himself speaking with some of the neighbors, receiving their thanks for his part in the renovations. But as he spoke, he realized that it wasn't just the house that had been changed, it was the entire neighborhood, the whole community. They were witnessing something more than just the physical transformation of a home. They were seeing the rebirth of a family that had been given a chance at a future they hadn't thought possible. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard, David stood next to Clara and Lucas on the porch. They watched as the last of the neighbors said their goodbyes, the air filled with contentment and a sense of fulfillment. Clara turned to David, her smile soft and full of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. David. For everything. For helping us rebuild our home, our lives, our future." David looked at her, his voice full of warmth. "You've done more for me than you know, Clara. You've shown me what truly matters. And I'll never forget that." Lucas, who had been standing nearby, looked up at David, his eyes full of determination. "I'm going to make a difference, just like you, mister. I'll make sure this keeps going. I won't forget what you've done for us." David's heart swelled with pride. "You already are, Lucas. You already are." They stood together, a family, watching as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon. The house, once in disrepair, now stood strong and vibrant, a symbol of the journey they had all shared. David knew that as much as this house had been a project, it had been the beginning of something far greater, a new life, a new purpose, and a future full of possibilities. As the evening settled in, David felt the weight of the day lift from his shoulders. He had come here to make a difference, and in the process, he had found something far more meaningful than he had ever expected, a place to belong. And as he stood there, surrounded by the people who had become his family, David knew that this was just the start of something incredible. As the night grew darker and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, David felt a deep sense of fulfillment settle over him. The house was quiet now, but in the stillness, it was clear that this place had become more than just a physical structure. It had become a home, a foundation for a future that was brighter than it had ever been before. Lucas stood beside him, his presence a reminder of the journey they had all undertaken. David could feel the boy's determination, his eagerness to make a difference, and it filled him with pride. They were a family now, bound by more than just the walls of this house. They were bound by a shared purpose, a commitment to building something meaningful, not just for themselves, but for those around them. "What's next, mister?" Lucas asked, his voice full of hope and curiosity. David glanced down at him, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Well, first we take a moment to enjoy this. But after that, I think there's a whole world out there waiting for us to make a difference. We'll do it together." Lucas grinned, the excitement never fading from his eyes. "I can't wait." David turned his gaze to Clara, who had joined them on the porch, standing silently beside her son. Her eyes met his, and in that brief exchange, David understood everything that had happened. The renovations, the changes, they weren't just about fixing a house. They were about healing hearts, about creating something lasting and real. Clara smiled, her voice warm and steady. "Thank you, Mr. David. You've given us so much more than just a new house. You've given us a future." David nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle deep within him. "And you've given me something too, Clara. Something I didn't even know I was looking for." The three of them stood together, side by side, watching the night unfold. The world felt full of possibility, and for the first time in a long time, David felt like he had found his place in it. A place where he could make a difference, where he could contribute to something real and lasting. And as the stars shone above them, David knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges, more work to do, but they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and with hearts full of hope for what the future would bring. The door closed behind them, and the familiar hum of life within the home surrounded them. The house, once worn down and tired, was now alive, a true reflection of the people who lived in it. Every room, every corner, felt like a piece of their story, their journey, their growth. David looked at Clara, who was watching him with a soft smile, her eyes full of gratitude and something deeper, something more. She had been more than a partner in this endeavor. She had been a teacher, showing him that real wealth was measured in moments, in connections, in the difference made in the lives of others. "Dreams," David repeated softly, his voice filled with a quiet promise. Lucas looked up at him, eyes wide with excitement, already thinking of the endless possibilities. "What kind of dreams, mister?" David knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze. The kind that take you places you never thought you'd go. The kind that make you want to help others, just like you've been helping me. You've already started, Lucas. I have no doubt you'll do amazing things. Clara joined them, wrapping an arm around Lucas's shoulders, her voice steady with love. And we'll be right here every step of the way. You, me, and Mr. David. Together. David smiled, feeling a deep warmth fill his chest. It was more than just a house, more than just a renovation. It was the foundation of something unshakable. A family built on love, trust, and shared dreams. The night settled around them, but inside, the future was bright. And as they moved forward into this new chapter, David knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger and more connected than ever before. The world was full of possibilities, and together, they would make the most of them.